Okay, tomorrow is Peonage Custom and Tribute Payment Day, otherwise known in America as Tax Day. But of course, it isn't Tax Day because we don't have a tax system here in America. It's a system of peonage debt service. First, by voluntary peonage debt service, and later it becomes involuntary if you attempt to oppose the imposed involuntary servitude that they are compelling the American people to. There is a law, Title 26, Section 7809, that says every penny collected as tax must be deposited into the U.S. Treasury. The reason why it says that is because tax is money for the government to spend, Congress, and Congress can only appropriate funds that are in the Treasury. So if it's not in the Treasury, Congress can't spend it. And that's why all taxes are required to be deposited in the Treasury, because it's money for the government to use to fund itself, and Congress can only appropriate funds from the Treasury. So explain to me why none of the money taken from your paychecks all year long as employees, reported on a W-2, authorized by the W-4 employees withholding allowance certificate, where you voluntarily allow and ask your employer to deduct money as tax when there's no tax imposed on your wages, on your right to work. Rights aren't taxable. And there's no requirement to file a Form 1040. That's not the form required by law. In fact, right now, if you look up in the law what form is required, there is none. They removed the requirement in the year 2000 because it exposed the fraud. This information is all on taxfreedom.com, and the documents to prove it are available at irszoom.com. So if you want to get educated, you can. But the money's not going in the Treasury, and I can prove it to you. Why don't you call the Treasury on January 10th and tell them you just got your W-2, you think the employer made a mistake? Can they please tell you how much money they have recorded as being deposited into the Treasury under Section 7809 for the monies that were withheld from your paycheck by your employer all year long? And what will they tell you? Well, what they'll tell you is, of course, is we don't have that, we can't get that, those records, da. But if they were honest, what would they say? They would say zero, not one penny. How is it possible for tax to be collected from your paycheck all year long? It's required by law to deposit in the Treasury, and yet after 12 months later, there's no deposit in the Treasury of any tax taken from your paycheck. It isn't there. It isn't there. Well, the law says it has to be there if it's tax. So the only explanation for its not being there is it's not tax. It was voluntarily debt service. See, where all the money went was not in the Treasury as tax. It went to the Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation, to service and collateralize the $35 trillion in debt run up by Congress. And your labor is being used in a peonage system to collateralize the unlawful and unconstitutional lending between the agreement with the Federal Reserve Bank and the government, which gave the Federal Reserve Bank an unconstitutional monopoly on currency and credit, where they are now allowed to buy $100 bills for 3.5 cents each from the Bureau of Printing and Engraving and then lend them back to the government at full face value. Can you buy $100 bills at 3.5 cents each? Will they print notes for you? They're printing Federal Reserve notes for the Federal Reserve Bank, and then they sell them to the bank as property of the bank, and that's why it says on the note, Federal Reserve note instead of US dollar. It's not a dollar, it's not evidence of wealth, it's a note, it's evidence of debt. And your money being taken from your paychecks all year long under the guise and pretense of tax is actually peonage debt service imposed on you through the propaganda that you're deceived and the lack of education that you're given before age 18 or 16 when you start working and take your first job. And right on that return, single and zero, right on the W-4, single and zero, and thereby enslave yourself through ignorance for the rest of your life. The rest of your life. You want more proof? Okay, when you fill out a Form 1040, which isn't required by law, and send it in on April 15th, and you send it in with a check, where do you think the money goes? Well, if you want to know what's really going on in this world, you don't listen to what they say, you follow the money. So on the front of the check, you write either Internal Revenue Service, the U.S. Treasury, you put down the amount of quote unquote tax you're paying, and you send it in, and then what happens? Well, by law, as tax, Section 7809 says every penny of it has to be deposited into the Treasury almost immediately. But if you want to know what's going on, listen to what they say. You follow the money. So if you want to follow the money with a check you wrote, you have to go and get a copy of the check from the bank, both sides, front and back, and turn it over and see what the endorsement says. Because that's what tells you where the money went, and that's how you follow the money. You don't look at the front. You don't ask your bank if it was cashed. You look at the back to see what the endorsement says. And if it was U.S. tax, it will say on the back of the canceled check, deposit to the U.S. Treasury. But guess what? That isn't what it says. Can you guess what it says? Probably not. I'll tell you. Pay to any FRB. That's what it says. Pay to any FRB. Federal Reserve Bank. A private corporation. Why is a private corporation cashing your so-called tax check when tax is money for the government to spend and it's required by law to be deposited in the Treasury, but that's not happening. Instead, it's going to the Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation, who is the beneficiary of all of the so-called tax revenues raised from the personal federal income tax. It's not a tax system at all, people. Wake up. It's a system of enslavement, of debt peonage, of annual custom and tribute. And as long as the American people allow themselves to be treated and behave themselves as peons and serfs, uneducated, uninformed, and blindly obedient to the tyrannical governments of man and men, as long as you allow your faith to be misplaced in government instead of God, you will be enslaved by that misplaced faith. God's true plan for mankind is freedom. Not enslavement to the church, not enslavement to the government, not enslavement to a particular philosophy, but freedom. Only God delivers freedom. Freedom is the spirit, not the flesh. The flesh can be caged and enslaved and inevitably deteriorates. It's only the spirit that lasts forever. And God's true plan for mankind is the freedom of the spirit. Freedom achieved through faith in God. Not man, not king, not institution, not philosophy. Only God delivers freedom in exchange for faith. Everybody else delivers enslavement, abusing your foolishly misplaced faith in something other than God and Spirit. We don't have a tax system in America. It's a system of involuntary servitude and virtual peonage. You've been enslaved on the 11th century peonage plantation system, where the master on the hill, Congress, Capitol Hill, gives all the little peons and serfs, the general population, a little plot of land to work on the plantation, i.e. your job. But you don't get to keep the fruits of labor or the produce from your plot of land, because every year at harvest time, April 15th, the master comes around and tells the peons and the serfs how much of their annual produce they have to turn over to the master, so that the master can pay his whores, his gambling buddies, his royal court, his business partners, his associates, his munition suppliers, and, of course, his ruler. And the peons get no say in how much money they have to turn over, and they get no say in how the money is spent or where it goes. The master takes it from them and continues his tyrannical existence over them and their lives and their domain. And of course, the ruler, in our analogy, with the companies being the overseers, the general population being the peons and the serfs, the master on the hill being Capitol Hill and Congress, and the ruler, of course, being the Federal Reserve Bank, the institution that invaded you insidiously during 1913 as World War I was distracting the world. The Federal Reserve Bank invaded and conquered America. And now you pay annual custom and tribute to the conquering invader. It just wasn't a military invasion. It was a financial and economic invasion and takeover. So now we are ruled by the elite, the Federal Reserve Bank. Who owns the Federal Reserve Bank? Nobody knows. It's never been audited. It doesn't pay tax. It has a monopoly on currency and credit. And you can never pay it back, because if you pay back the debt, there will be no medium of exchange and circulation sufficient to conduct the daily transactions of society. So it's a perpetual enslavement system that enslaves each new generation to an ever greater extent, until ultimately there is no freedom left anywhere, there is no property left anywhere to be owned. It's all possessed and controlled exclusively by the world's elites, not just the wealthy in America, but around the planet. You haven't noticed American properties being bought up by foreigners in Hawaii, on the beaches, in the farms, near military bases? You're being ruled, not represented. That's the effect of a graduated income tax, which divides the American people into classes and then doesn't treat them uniformly under the tax law, which is the constitutional requirement. Instead, it breaks them into different classes, literally defined by the brackets of the income tax. And then the classes are set at warfare with one another in a system of class warfare rather than unified representation. The politicians have to pick one class or the other and can never represent the whole of the American people. The pendulum swings from side to side, ever escalating and ever increasing as all parties on both sides constantly call for government to step in and end the class warfare it engineered, and which it is intentionally keeping in place and using in order to leverage more and more power into its own hands, to exercise ever greater controls over the people, their property, their earnings, their wealth, and every single aspect of our society, which, of course, is tyranny, despotism, and enslavement. It is not the spiritual freedom that motivated the founding fathers to write a system based on the individual being the sovereign instead of the king or the government. There is no king, and the government is our representative. Who the hell do they think they represent if not the sovereign people? We, the people, are the owners of the nation. The government is not our ruler, it is not our king, and it is unacceptable for them to act in the tyrannical and despotical manner that they have been. The American people need to get educated, informed, and stand up and take back their freedom, not with violence, but with knowledge. Knowledge of the truth. For the truth shall make you free. And it's all out there on the tax-freedom.com website. The documents are all available. The information, the education is all available in the American Tax Bible and other materials for sale for as little as $4 at irszoom.com. The information is there. What we lack is a people of America thirsting for the knowledge necessary to restore your freedom. Do you want your freedom back? Do you see where we're being taken now? Do you see? If you don't, wake the fuck up. Because it's going to be too late pretty soon. We need to restore constitutional government before this despotic tyranny of literally communism, because that's where income tax comes from. That's where graduated taxation comes from. Communism, the second plank of the Communist Manifesto. That's what's being enforced against you now. A heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. Divide the people into classes, set them at warfare with one another, take advantage of the situation, and while the people are busy fighting the class warfare with each other, they'll never notice it's the political class that's looting the Treasury and enriching themselves and their own business partners and world elite partners in a conspiracy to enslave and rule not just America, but the whole planet. The whole planet. That's why you're at war with Russia. They want the natural resources in Russia for their global socialism, and Putin won't give them access to it. They figure if they can take Putin out, they can pay off the rest of the Russian people and get access to the resources with control of America and Europe and the Russian resources and the partnership with China. It won't take much more, will it? So it's time. This system needs to end. We need a system of real taxation that funds the government without feeding the perpetual debt. Because the consequences of this system, instead of revenues accumulating in the Treasury all year from tax collections and going into the Treasury, and then there's a hurricane in the fall. So Congress needs to run to the Treasury to draw on the tax revenues that are collected there. We need $1 billion to give to FEMA to help the people of the hurricane or the earthquake or the flood or whatever disaster has occurred. Oh, but when they get to the Treasury, there's no money there. The tax revenues aren't accumulating there from being collected all year long. There's no money. So what do they have to do? That's right, borrow another $1 trillion from the Federal Reserve Bank to take care of the disaster in this year's budget. So it's a constant system of debt that ensures Congress has no option but to borrow more from the bankers. And as long as the American people accept the role of peon and serf and virtual slave, it's not physical slavery with whips and chains, it's virtual economic slavery with financial and economic extortion. It's a system of extortion, threats, intimidation, and theft. Literally theft. And that's all exposed too on taxfreedom.com. So, America, get informed, get educated, wake up, or die a slave and condemn your progeny to an endless life of slavery as well. Do you want your freedom back, or are you gonna lie down and die? Stand up and fight, or lie down and die. Those are your two choices now. There's no more sitting on the porch and watching to see what happens. We know what's going to happen. Stand up and fight, or lie down and die. Freedom comes from God, not government.